Hello and welcome back to Dukascopy TV. I'm Natalie MacDonald, bringing you yet another exclusive interview. Now, never short of an opinion or three, Dr. Frank Hollenbeck is in the studio with us now. Dr. Frank, thank you very much for coming in.
Good to be here.
Now, we're going to be discussing growth today, but firstly, I'd like to start with an uproar that has been had over a coding error mistake in a key paper by Reinhardt and Rogoff that showed that growth slowed significantly once a country went over the threshold of 90% debt to GDP ratio. What is our take on this?
Well, I must admit there's been quite a bit of an academic firestorm over this particular issue. For me, it's much ado about nothing. Okay, if you look at the correction that's been made to the paper, it basically said that there is no threshold. There's no key threshold of over 90%. But as we can see from this data, we can see that as debt increases, growth decreases. But then again, I don't think we should draw too much inferences from this particular paper. This kind of reminds me of the early studies on the demand curve. In other words, some of the early studies on the demand curve looked at the relationship, for example, between the quantity of food purchased and the price of food. And here we have data from 1948 to 1999. And if you look at this data, you would say that the demand curve is upward sloping. Obviously, though, this is wrong. And the reason is that we've violated a key assumption, which is the ceteris paribus assumption, which means holding everything else constant. And what you actually have here is not a demand curve. What you actually have here are equilibrium points between supply and demand. So you're going to say, well, what should we do? Well, what I say is go back to theory. Theory tells you that if you reduce the price, you're going to have a substitution and an income effect so that as you reduce the price, people will want to consume a greater quantity of the product. And it's why Walmart will reduce its price to be able to sell more. It won't raise its price to be able to sell more. So we know that the demand curve is downward sloping. Well, we can say the same thing about debt and growth. Okay? Every dollar that the government borrows to finance government consumption is a dollar that would probably have been borrowed by businesses to purchase plant and equipment, which is the real source of growth. So for me, there is a threshold, but it's not 90%. I do have a threshold, it's 0%.
Now, if we take a look at austerity, the IMF have downgraded their growth outlook for Britain and the US and have projected another year of recession for the Eurozone region. They have also suggested that countries should ease off on their austerity drive, and this comes as you've got more high-ranking ministers and officials who are talking about the need to slow down the pace of budget cutting and bolstering growth on the continent. Do you agree?
Well, I'm not for austerity. I think it's bad economics. And austerity is neither classical, Keynesian, or Austrian. Austerity, which is to cut spending and raise taxes, implies a reallocation of resources, which will cause the economy to shrink. Okay. However, because the private sector is shrinking faster than the public sector, we have a situation where the role of the public sector is becoming larger and larger as the economy shrinks. That can only lead to a death spiral in growth. The right type of austerity is to cut spending and cut taxes. In other words, free up resources so that they go into the private sector, and it's the private sector that's going to lead us to growth. Let me explain where growth comes from. Why is your standard of living higher than individuals in Africa? Is it because you work harder, or is it because you're more intelligent than individuals in Africa? And the answer is no. The reason your standard of living is higher is because your labor is grafted onto a larger capital base than you have in Africa. Let me give you an example. Suppose that you have Robinson Crusoe, who's basically fishing with his hands. Okay? Is the solution to make him hungrier? In other words, he has a greater demand for fish. No. Okay. The solution is for him to free up resources, in other words, to stop fishing, and spend the time to build a net. And once he's built the net, he'll be able to catch more fish. That is the source of growth. In other words, an increase in the capital base. The problem we have today is that it's almost too late to do the right type of austerity. as Latvia did in 2009 and 2010. But I do know that to get growth, you need to have the government not borrow from the private sector, okay? And it's got to liberate resources so that it goes back into the private sector, and it's the private sector that's going to lead us to growth. That's the solution. I'm not really sure that the policies that we're going to implement in Europe are going to lead us on the right path.
Dr. Frank, thank you very much. Possibly our only guest that could put Robinson Crusoe into a financial explanation. Dr. Frank Hollenbeck will be back with us next week, but don't go away. We've got plenty more exclusive interviews for you. Goodbye for now.